Hey guys, let me tell you something. The ancient Egyptians, a civilization known for its grand pyramids, impressive temples, and deeply spiritual culture, had one thing that wasn't nearly as glamorous as we like to think about today. Their rulers were, for lack of a better term, kind of absurd. And I'm not talking about the usual, just a little eccentric sort of absurdity. No, I'm talking full-blown. This is borderline ridiculous absurdity. It's the kind of thing that, when you look back at it, you can't help but laugh, and maybe feel a bit better about the oddities we have in our own day-to-day lives. But let's start with the basics, because before we dive into the bizarre decisions these pharaohs were making, we need to understand just how powerful they really were. Pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods, or at least they were supposed to be. They didn't simply rule, they were seen as the intermediary between the gods and the people, like the walking, talking link between mortal life and the divine. They wore crowns that were so flashy they looked like they belonged in a museum exhibit about ancient things you'd never wear to a party. And for all their divine duties, they also had a rather peculiar sense of what constituted an ideal leadership style. Take, for instance, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, or as he decided to call himself, Akhenaten. He wasn't exactly your run-of-the-mill pharaoh. No, he decided that Egypt should only worship the sun god Aten and not the entire pantheon of gods they had worshipped for centuries. This was a pretty bold move, considering that Egypt was literally built on the idea that gods were everywhere, not just in one glowing ball of fire in the sky. But Akhenaten didn't stop there. He went ahead and shut down all the temples to the old gods. If you were a high priest in ancient Egypt, imagine getting that memo. Sorry, we're no longer offering sacrifices to Osiris because we're now all about the sun. Hope that's cool with you. The fact that this move was so unpopular is an understatement. People were probably shaking their heads thinking, well, this is going to end well. It didn't. Akhenaten's reign is a fascinating case of ruling with what can only be described as single-minded devotion to a ridiculous idea. The guy essentially created an entire new capital city for his sun worship, Amarna, which was a bit like building a Disneyland for one particular belief system, but with fewer fun rides and more sand. By the time he died, Egypt was in disarray, and his successors promptly reversed everything he'd done. Talk about a temporary trend, huh? It's as if the history books couldn't wait to take down the whole chapter on Akhenaten. A little absurd, right? But Akhenaten wasn't the only pharaoh who thought, hey, let's do something really strange that everyone will have to go along with. No, the absurdity ran much deeper than just religious upheaval. Another fine example comes from the reign of Ramses II, often called Ramses the Great. Now, Ramses was quite the character. He made some of the most bizarre decisions you could imagine. Sure, he was a military leader, winning wars and solidifying his power in the region. But his most absurd legacy? The sheer volume of monuments and statues he had built in his own honor. Now, if you're the pharaoh and you want people to remember you, you build a few statues, maybe a couple of grand temples. But Ramses went all in. He was so obsessed with being remembered that he put his face on absolutely everything. There are statues of him as a young man, statues of him as an older man, statues of him in battle, statues of him just standing there. It was like he was his own walking ad campaign. Picture this. You're a peasant, going about your day, and you're basically tripping over a statue of Ramses every time you turn a corner. You'd think after a while even the gods would get annoyed with all the Ramses statues. But it didn't stop there. Ramses also decided to build 2 massive temples at Abu Simbel, because apparently one giant temple wasn't enough for his ego. These temples were so big, so monumental, that they literally had to carve them out of a mountain to make them work. And then, because why not, he had his own likeness carved into the side of the mountain. Now, sure, it's an impressive feat of engineering, but when you step back and think about it, it's just a little over the top. It's like throwing a party and then spending half of it just talking about how great you are. Ramses wasn't subtle about it. You can't blame him for not understanding the fine art of humility. And speaking of monuments to themselves, let's talk about the even more absurd decision-making when it came to tombs. For some reason, pharaohs were obsessed with the idea of their tombs being perfect. And by perfect, I mean they needed to be colossal, elaborate, and filled with treasures that could sustain them in the afterlife. This is where things get truly over the top. One pharaoh, Khufu, had the Great Pyramid of Giza built, and it was so massive that it became the largest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years. To put it in perspective, imagine if someone today said, "You know what? I think it's time to build a pyramid that'll take 20 years and thousands of workers to finish. Oh, and we'll use massive blocks of stone because why not?" Talk about a way to leave your mark on history. What's even more absurd is that Khufu's successors didn't think, let's scale it back a little. No, they just kept building bigger and bigger pyramids until it got to the point where these tombs became nothing more than a game of one-upmanship. It's like a ridiculous arms race, but instead of nuclear weapons, it was a lot of heavy lifting and stone carving. But it wasn't just about monuments and grand tombs. The real absurdity of some of these pharaohs came from their daily decisions. Have you ever wondered what it must have been like to live under the rule of these larger-than-life figures? Well, let's just say the power they wielded came with some pretty strange expectations. Pharaohs were seen as gods, and that meant they needed to keep up with some pretty bizarre customs. One of the strangest things about the royal lifestyle was the ceremonial nature of everything. Pharaohs had an entourage of servants whose only job was to make sure the pharaoh never, ever had to lift a finger. So if you were working as a servant in the royal court, imagine your job was literally to stand there while the pharaoh, in his full splendor, did very little except look majestic. But hey, it paid well, right? Well, if your idea of a good job was being part of an ever-expanding network of sycophants whose main task was to not disturb the pharaoh, there were even people whose sole responsibility was to attend to the pharaoh's personal needs, from feeding him to, well, feeding him some more. Yes, the pharaoh had servants whose only job was to prepare food for him and then prepare more food, just in case he wasn't feeling like the first course anymore. Talk about luxury. And of course, there were the divine rituals that the pharaohs had to endure. It wasn't just about ruling the kingdom. It was about being seen as the perfect representation of the gods on earth. So, when they weren't busy lounging around or getting lavish gifts, they were performing rituals. These weren't just any rituals, though. Oh, no. Some of them were designed to demonstrate the pharaoh's divinity in the most bizarre ways. Imagine a pharaoh stepping into a sacred boat that would carry him down the Nile for a ritual purification process, surrounded by priests chanting and throwing offerings into the water. It's one thing to take a boat ride for relaxation, but it's another thing entirely when the boat becomes a moving stage for you to perform divine duties. The absurdity continued in how they thought about food. Pharaohs had so many servants involved in their meals that it could be considered an early form of a food industry. There were specialized chefs, bakers, butchers, and even beer makers. Yes, you heard that right. Beer was a staple of the pharaoh's diet, and it was brewed in such large quantities that it would make a modern-day brewery look like a child's lemonade stand. These pharaohs were so far removed from the everyday reality of life that it's almost as if they lived in a bubble of their own making. If you were lucky enough to be part of the elite, it was a life of absolute luxury. But if you were an ordinary worker, well, let's just say it wasn't quite so glamorous. So, what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, ancient Egypt wasn't just about grand monuments or mummies. Sometimes it was about making decisions that, in hindsight, make you wonder if the pharaohs had a few too many sun-baked days in the desert. But then again, when you're in charge of the entire kingdom, what else are you going to do? But while the pharaohs lived in such extravagance, their bizarre decisions and oddball customs often seem to defy logic. I mean, how else do you explain a society that went to such lengths to preserve the dead while often ignoring the basics of public health? Sure, they built the pyramids, but some of their other ideas were a little less grand. For example, the practice of mummifying animals, which wasn't just for the rich and famous. Oh no, they mummified everything from cats to crocodiles. Yes, crocodiles. The irony is that while they were obsessed with keeping the bodies of animals perfectly preserved, they had no qualms about letting their workers do the kind of back-breaking labor that would leave anyone else complaining after just a few hours. It's like if ancient Egyptians were in charge of modern-day museums, they'd probably put up a "Do Not Touch" sign next to a skeleton of a rat, but let you walk right past a replica of the Great Pyramid's foundation while its construction workers hunched over and dug into the blazing desert sun, drenched in sweat and probably not much else in the way of comfort. It's almost like the pharaohs were more concerned about how things would look centuries after they were gone, rather than the well-being of their own people at the time. One such example of this bizarre concern with preserving things for eternity involves the extravagant tombs of the pharaohs. You might think, oh, the pharaohs just wanted to leave behind something lasting for history to admire. Well, yeah, but they also had a funny way of going about it. I mean, here's the thing. Not only were the tombs insanely elaborate, but they were also filled with the most ridiculous items. Take, for example, the famous tomb of Tutankhamun. Inside, among the gold treasures and priceless artifacts, there was a whole bunch of everyday items. Items like walking sticks, sandals, and even board games. Board games. So the pharaoh was buried with his favorite games to pass the time in the afterlife, which is great. But when you think about it, what was he supposed to do with them? Play against the other mummies? Was there a ghostly pharaoh league he was joining? Or were there eternal competitions for the title of best game player in the afterlife? The sheer absurdity of it is almost mind-boggling. And of course, you have the royal fashion. Don't even get me started on the fashion choices of the Egyptian elite. While common folk were lucky to have a few simple linen garments, the pharaohs wore elaborate headdresses, towering crowns, and the kind of gold-plated bling that would make today's rappers jealous. Now, you might think that was all for ceremonial purposes, and you'd be right. But there was also a strange obsession with looking not just regal, but almost absurdly over the top. Take the famous headdress of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, for example. The thing weighed more than most modern backpacks, and it was, frankly, a bit ridiculous. But in the ancient Egyptian mind, this was a sign of their supreme connection to the gods. Imagine walking around in 100-degree heat with a giant gold headpiece on. It's like they were willing to endure discomfort to maintain their gods are watching image. Perhaps it was all part of the illusion of divinity. They didn't just want to appear godly. They wanted to be godly, even if it meant looking completely impractical in the process. Now, as absurd as some of the pharaohs' personal quirks were, it wasn't just the rulers who had strange traditions. Let's not forget the bizarre practices of the priests, who played a huge role in all of this. Priests were the ones responsible for conducting rituals, managing temples, and ensuring that everything was done according to the gods' wishes. And some of these rituals? Well, they ranged from the odd to the outright ridiculous. For example, when a pharaoh died, priests would often engage in lengthy and bizarre ceremonies to ensure the king's soul would make its way to the afterlife. This wasn't just a simple say a prayer and move on kind of thing. We're talking about days of ritual, chanting, offerings of food and wine, and all kinds of strange trinkets being buried with the pharaoh to help them on their journey. It was like the ancient Egyptian version of sending someone off on a long road trip with snacks, travel pillows, and a GPS system that, well, didn't really work since, they didn't have GPS. But perhaps one of the strangest things the ancient Egyptians did was their peculiar relationship with animals. Now, we've already touched on their habit of mummifying animals, but did you know that they believed animals were not just companions, but actual divine messengers? Take cats, for example. Cats were worshipped by the ancient Egyptians to such an extent that if you killed a cat, whether by accident or on purpose, you could be sentenced to death. That's right. A simple mistake could cost you your life. Cats were so highly revered that they were considered to be a direct link to the gods, and in some cases, families even kept special tombs for their deceased cats. Can you imagine living in a world where a cat's life was worth more than your own? That's a lot of pressure on your pet to live a respectable, dignified life. And you can bet there were probably a few cats who enjoyed the royal treatment while the humans around them worked like, well, animals. And let's not forget about the royal food, which was prepared in a way that could only be described as highly extra. If you've ever imagined the pharaohs sitting down to a lavish feast, you're right. But what you might not know is that the food wasn't just abundant. It was often incredibly elaborate. For instance, some meals featured roasted birds and exotic fruits. But there was also an absurd level of care that went into food preparation. This wasn't just about filling the stomach. It was about impressing everyone at the table. You had chefs that specialized in preparing meals that would leave you scratching your head, wondering if there was some ancient culinary school where they taught how to make the most complicated dish that no one will ever ask for again. And the beverage of choice, beer, was no simple lager. It was a thick, porridge-like concoction that was drunk in huge quantities. So, you had the royal court getting tipsy off what was essentially a soupy bread brew, while their servants likely looked on, thinking about how they'd love to have just one tiny sip of the pharaoh's beer instead of the watery stuff they were drinking. But in the grand scheme of things, these ridiculous royal customs and absurd decisions all came back to one thing: power. The pharaohs lived their lives in a world of unimaginable luxury, but at the same time, they were governed by an overwhelming need to project their divine right to rule, even if that meant doing things that didn't exactly make sense. They were, after all, living embodiments of the gods. And when you're a living god, it turns out there's not much in the way of common sense to get in your way. Which, of course, leads us to wonder, was there ever a moment in history when someone stood up and said, maybe we should, stop mummifying cats and start focusing on the people who are actually building our pyramids? Probably not. After all, it's hard to get a good protest going when your pharaoh is probably the most powerful person on earth and has an army of priests and bureaucrats backing up every weird tradition. In the end, the absurdities of ancient Egypt are a part of what makes the civilization so fascinating. There were rules, customs, and decisions that, with a little distance, make you scratch your head and think, who came up with that? But perhaps the most bizarre thing of all was that, for all the strange customs and absurd ideas, the ancient Egyptians were able to build one of the most enduring and influential cultures in history. So while they might have mummified a few too many cats and spent a little too much time worrying about their afterlife wardrobes, they certainly knew how to make their mark on the world. So, as we continue on this wild journey into the absurd decisions of the rulers of ancient Egypt, it's important to recognize that, for all their grandeur and power, these pharaohs were not necessarily the paragons of rational decision-making. Sure, they built massive structures, established vast empires, and amassed incredible wealth, but they also made some choices that, if we're being honest, seem utterly baffling in hindsight. It's like they were so caught up in their divinity and the endless praise from their followers that they sometimes lost touch with the practicalities of, well, being a decent ruler. And in a way, it's kind of endearing, if not entirely effective. Take, for example, the whole idea of royal inbreeding. Now, we all know that the ancient Egyptians were big on family dynasties. Pharaohs liked to keep the power within the family, which made sense, given how much emphasis was placed on bloodlines and the divine right to rule. But it wasn't just about marrying within the same social circles. Oh, no. The pharaohs were notorious for marrying their siblings. And not just one sibling at a time, but multiple times. We're talking about brothers marrying sisters, and even fathers marrying their daughters. And why? Because the pharaoh was considered a god, and gods couldn't possibly marry mere mortals. So they married each other to keep the bloodline pure. Seems like a nice thought, but it's the kind of thing that leads to, shall we say, genetically interesting results. I mean, just imagine the conversations at a royal banquet. So, how's your wife? Oh, the usual. She's also my sister, but we've been having some issues with the royal bloodline, so we're going to keep it all in the family. Normal family stuff. It's almost like they just thought, if we keep this whole divine family thing going strong, we'll be fine. But really, they were just opening the door for all kinds of strange health conditions to crop up in the next generation. But hey, it wasn't like anyone was going to question the divine right of the pharaohs, right? And then, of course, there's the little matter of their obsession with the afterlife. Now, let's be clear. The ancient Egyptians were deeply spiritual people. They had a rich and complex religious belief system that permeated every aspect of life. Death was seen as a journey to the afterlife, a place of eternal peace, where the soul could live forever in the company of the gods. Sounds nice, right? But, well, they might have taken it just a little bit too far. Take the construction of the pyramids, for instance. Now, we all know the pyramids are awe-inspiring, massive structures that still stand to this day. But the real reason they were built? Pharaohs wanted a fancy place to rest for all eternity. And to get there, they didn't just want a simple tomb. No, they wanted something grand, something monumental, something that screamed, "I'm a god, and I demand eternal recognition." The amount of resources that went into these tombs was staggering. Not just the stones and labor that went into the pyramid itself, but the elaborate burial chambers, the treasures, the food offerings. Everything was meticulously planned out to ensure that the pharaoh would have everything they could possibly need in the afterlife. And let's not forget the elaborate rituals. The Egyptians believed in all kinds of rituals to ensure that the pharaoh's soul would pass safely into the afterlife. But some of these rituals were, well, let's just say they were a little over the top, like the practice of having people buried alive with the pharaoh. You know, just in case the pharaoh might need a few servants in the afterlife. It's not enough that the pharaoh's tomb was loaded with gold and fine linens. No, they needed human sacrifices to keep them company for eternity. But this obsession with the afterlife didn't just affect the pharaohs. It trickled down to the common people as well. In fact, the entire society was geared toward securing a good afterlife. Priests and nobles would build elaborate tombs for themselves, and families would invest heavily in their loved ones' burials. Because if you didn't have a proper tomb, or if you weren't properly mummified, your soul would wander aimlessly for eternity, which, honestly, doesn't sound like a great deal. So you had this bizarre situation where not just the wealthy, but pretty much everyone was doing everything they could to ensure they had a smooth transition into the afterlife. Imagine living in a world where, instead of worrying about things like food, shelter, or social stability, your main concern was whether your soul would end up being cursed for eternity. It's the kind of thing that would keep you up at night. But the absurdity doesn't end there. Oh no, because the pharaohs were also notorious for their bizarre whims when it came to laws and customs. One example, the pharaoh Akhenaten, who decided quite suddenly that Egypt should abandon its traditional polytheism and focus all worship on a single god, the sun god, Aten. Now, this may not sound entirely ridiculous at first glance, but Akhenaten's decision to radically change the religion of an entire empire was, shall we say, not particularly popular. He essentially dismantled centuries of religious tradition and introduced this brand new idea of monotheism, where the sun god was the one true god and everyone else, well, everyone else was kind of irrelevant. But it wasn't just the religion that was affected. Akhenaten also moved the capital to a brand new city, Amarna, and insisted that all art should depict people in a more naturalistic, almost exaggerated way. Pharaohs were usually depicted in idealized, godlike forms, but Akhenaten took it a step further, encouraging artists to depict the royal family in ways that, frankly, looked a little odd long faces, bulging bellies, and arms that seemed a little too noodly. It's as if Akhenaten thought, you know what would be fun? Let's completely change everything. And while he was at it, he also closed down temples dedicated to other gods and essentially made worshiping the old gods illegal. People weren't too happy about this, to say the least. It's almost like Akhenaten woke up one morning, took a look around, and thought, yeah, I think it's time we throw out everything that's been working for thousands of years. Of course, after his death, his successors, namely Tutankhamun, abandoned his reforms and went back to the old ways. It was like, all right, let's just pretend that never happened. Now, let's not forget about the bizarre customs that the ruling class insisted upon. In ancient Egypt, a lot of importance was placed on appearances, especially among the royal family. Take, for instance, the tradition of shaving. If you were part of the elite, you had to be meticulously clean-shaven, or else you risked being seen as unkempt. The pharaohs were no exception to this. In fact, they went to extreme lengths to maintain a perfectly groomed appearance. Pharaohs would often wear elaborate wigs made from human hair, which were so finely crafted that they looked almost lifelike. And it wasn't just the hair. They had to ensure that their skin, too, was perfectly smooth and flawless. It's like they took one look at the messy hair, facial hair, and general disarray of the common people and thought, nope, that won't do. We're going for perfection. But the most absurd part about this obsession with appearance? The constant worry about body odor. Now, we all know that personal hygiene wasn't exactly top-notch in the ancient world. Soap was not a common luxury, and deodorants as we know them didn't exist. But the pharaohs, in their infinite wisdom, went to great lengths to ensure they didn't smell. And how did they do that? By using an array of perfumes, oils, and incense to mask their natural scent. The pharaohs would douse themselves in these scents until they practically radiated fragrance. It's almost as if they were saying, we can't let anyone think we smell like humans. We're divine, and divine beings don't sweat. So while the common folk were probably struggling with the smell of sweat and unwashed bodies, the pharaohs were literally bathing in luxury, trying to convince everyone that they were above such unpleasantness. And you can't talk about bizarre royal decisions without mentioning the luxury of royal food. Now, the pharaohs had access to the finest delicacies, but the strange thing was how they sometimes made the most absurd food choices. For example, the pharaohs loved to indulge in meat, lots of it. They ate a wide variety of animals, from cattle to fowl to exotic game. But it wasn't just about eating meat for sustenance. Oh no, pharaohs would go to great lengths to ensure that their meat was the most tender, the most exquisite. This led to a bizarre practice where certain animals were raised solely for their meat, and some were even considered to be sacred animals, like the sacred bulls, which were treated like royalty before being slaughtered for consumption. The idea was that by eating such animals, the pharaoh could imbue themselves with the strength and divine qualities of the creatures they consumed. It's like the ancient Egyptian version of "you are what you eat," only with way more pomp and circumstance. And speaking of luxury, let's not forget about the incredible amounts of gold and precious materials that pharaohs loved to adorn themselves with. Jewelry, crowns, and the like were not just a sign of wealth, they were a sign of power. And this wasn't just limited to the pharaohs themselves. Their courtiers, officials, and nobles also adorned themselves with gold and precious stones, creating a culture where everything was about shimmering luxury and opulence. It's as if the more gold you wore, the closer you were to the gods themselves. But as lovely as all that gold must have looked, it also meant that they were living in a world where wealth and beauty were more important than, say, common sense or practical concerns. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. Despite all this obsession with gold and luxury, there was one thing that the ancient Egyptians didn't seem to care much about: hygiene. Oh, sure, they made sure to look the part, clean, regal, smelling like a garden of perfumes. But their approach to personal cleanliness was, let's say, not quite as glamorous. Personal bathing, while important in some contexts, wasn't exactly a daily ritual. So, while the royal court was busy making sure their skin was smooth and their wigs were perfect, there was no real attention given to things like regular washing. In a way, it's almost like they thought, as long as we look like gods, who cares if we're clean? It's an odd paradox, luxury and decadence on the surface, but underneath there's a whole lot of, well, not so glamorous realities. And so, we find ourselves left with these strange, sometimes laughable decisions of Egypt's rulers. Decisions that, at the time, probably seemed entirely reasonable. But when you step back and take a look at them from our modern vantage point, you can't help but chuckle at the absurdity. And yet, despite all the quirks and follies, ancient Egypt endured, carving its name into the annals of history for millennia to come, which, honestly, is a little impressive when you think about it. So, what can we learn from all of this? Perhaps that the ancient Egyptians were more human than we give them credit for. Yes, they were powerful, majestic, and built a civilization that still fascinates us today. But they were also a little ridiculous at times. And maybe that's part of what makes them so enduring. Because, in the end, if history teaches us anything, it's that even the most powerful empires sometimes make decisions that, in retrospect, seem, well, a bit out there. Let's talk more about the absurd customs and bizarre decisions of Egypt's rulers. Because, let's face it, the way they went about things sometimes seems downright ridiculous by today's standards. We've already touched on a few oddities, like the curious need for perpetual luxury and grandeur, but there's so much more to unpack. You see, Egypt's powerful rulers didn't always make decisions that reflected an astute sense of strategy. Sometimes they were just weird. And maybe that's why we're still so fascinated by them today. These larger-than-life figures that couldn't seem to shake their human flaws. Take, for instance, the ancient Egyptian obsession with immortality. Now, immortality might sound like a good idea on the surface. Who wouldn't want to live forever? But when you dig a little deeper, it becomes clear that the lengths to which the pharaohs went to secure their eternal life were downright bizarre. Imagine for a moment dedicating your entire existence to preparing for an afterlife that, if we're being honest, nobody really knows anything about. Pharaohs spent years and years gathering riches, building massive tombs, and organizing elaborate burial rituals, all to ensure that their souls would live on forever. And let's not even get started on the pyramids, those awe-inspiring yet utterly impractical monuments. Let's look at one of the most famous examples, King Tutankhamun. Yes, the boy king with the golden mask. Now, we're all familiar with the idea that he was buried with an astonishing amount of treasure, and his tomb remains one of the most remarkable archaeological finds of all time. But what really stands out is how absurd the whole situation was. The guy was 18 when he died, and his tomb was crammed with riches meant to support him in the afterlife. He had everything from jewelry to chariots to an actual boat, all buried with him in case he needed them in the next world. But here's the kicker. When archaeologists uncovered his tomb, they found that most of the items hadn't even been used. It was as though someone had just thrown in everything they could find without considering if it was even remotely useful for a guy who, was already dead. But the absurdity doesn't end there. The very idea of preserving the body for eternity through mummification, while undeniably impressive, also reveals some strange choices. Imagine spending days on end removing the organs, preserving them in jars, and covering your entire body in a special resin to keep it from decomposing. It's not exactly a relaxing spa day, is it? And all of this was done with the hope that the pharaoh's soul would somehow return to this preserved body. At the very least, it was an elaborate way to procrastinate on the inevitable, as if the process of mummification could delay death itself. If nothing else, it definitely gave the workers something to do. And then there's the whole notion of tomb robbing. Ancient Egyptians were well aware of this practice and went to great lengths to prevent it. You'd think they'd make sure the tombs were locked tight and hidden well, right? But no. Some tombs were so poorly designed that they practically begged to be looted. Pharaohs, who were supposed to be all-powerful and indomitable, sometimes went to great lengths to make sure their tombs would stay safe, only to fall victim to the very thing they feared most. And this wasn't just a one-off occurrence. Egypt had a whole culture of tomb raiding. The workers who built the pyramids, for example, weren't exactly paid handsomely. So they would sometimes take advantage of their access to the tombs, swiping valuables when nobody was looking. In some cases, entire royal tombs were plundered over the centuries. You'd think that with all their power, they could have prevented this. But in the end, it just kind of added to the hilarity of the situation. Now, let's pivot to some of the more absurd customs that went hand in hand with royal authority. There was a real need for the pharaohs to maintain an image of being otherworldly, a divinity that transcended mere mortals. And to achieve this, the ruling class relied on some of the most bizarre rituals. Take, for example, the peculiar way pharaohs were treated in public. The entire court would practically fall over themselves to cater to the pharaoh's every whim. But here's the thing. Sometimes the pharaoh would give the most mundane orders, and everyone would act like it was the most profound thing to happen all day. Want a new chariot? Done. Craving some figs? No problem. It's almost as if the pharaoh's entire existence was a performance, a long, drawn-out show designed to maintain the aura of divine power. And let's talk about the royal family itself for a moment. The pharaohs didn't just marry for love. They married to consolidate power, to maintain bloodlines, and to keep things strictly in the family. A royal marriage wasn't so much about affection as it was about ensuring that the divine line continued unbroken. In fact, some pharaohs went so far as to marry their own sisters or daughters in an attempt to keep the bloodline pure. There's something strangely eerie about the idea that your most sacred duty in life could involve marrying a family member, and the Egyptians weren't shy about it. This kind of incestuous marriage wasn't unique to Egypt. Many ancient civilizations did the same thing, but it does raise the question of whether these rulers ever stopped to wonder how odd their customs truly were. While we're on the subject of weird royal practices, we can't forget the bizarre beliefs surrounding the divine nature of the pharaohs. Pharaohs, you see, weren't just kings. They were gods on earth. Their role wasn't merely to rule over Egypt. It was to act as a direct link between the gods and the people, and so every royal action was imbued with a sense of divine importance, whether it was participating in religious ceremonies, overseeing the building of temples, or giving orders that might seem completely nonsensical to the average person. Imagine living in a society where every small action taken by the ruler was treated as a divine command. Need a new irrigation project? The pharaoh says it's necessary, and that's the end of it. No questions asked. But, as you might expect, even divine authority didn't protect the pharaohs from making some terribly misguided decisions. Take the famous example of Akhenaten, who decided to abolish Egypt's polytheistic religion in favor of worshiping one god, Aten, the sun disk. This might have seemed like a bold, progressive move at the time, but in practice, it was utterly absurd. It didn't just alienate the priests, who were essentially the power brokers of Egypt, but it also left the common people feeling completely disconnected from their spiritual practices. Egypt, a nation built on its rich religious traditions, was suddenly told that all those gods and goddesses they had been worshiping for centuries were nothing more than distractions. The whole thing was such a disaster that after Akhenaten's death, the country quickly reverted back to its old ways, and his name was erased from the official records. Talk about a failed experiment. Now, Akhenaten wasn't the only one who had some less than savory ideas about what was best for Egypt. Take, for example, the bizarre royal fashion choices of the time. Some pharaohs went so far as to wear lavish jewelry, gold headpieces, and even wigs that would have made a modern-day fashionista envious. But imagine wearing all of that in the hot desert sun. The sheer impracticality of it all is kind of staggering. You'd think that the pharaohs would opt for something a little more comfortable for day-to-day affairs. Instead, they chose to dress in a way that screamed, "Look at me, I'm a god." Whether it was impractical sandals, heavy cloaks, or a ridiculous headdress, the point was clear. The pharaoh's fashion was meant to reinforce their divine status. Yet, all these lavish items just made their daily lives look more uncomfortable and less human. But perhaps the strangest aspect of ancient Egyptian royalty was their obsession with keeping up appearances at all costs. The ancient Egyptians were master builders, renowned for their ability to create some of the most monumental structures in history. But many of these monuments were built for purely symbolic reasons. Take the vast temples and tombs. Sure, they were spectacular feats of architecture, but how much of it was really necessary? And how many workers were forced into grueling conditions just to make sure that the tombs of the pharaohs were as extravagant as possible? We like to imagine the Great Pyramids as marvels of engineering, which they are, but the truth is they were also giant ego projects, built not just to honor the dead, but to impress the living. The cost in terms of human suffering? Well, that was just part of the job. The pyramids, for all their grandeur, were a way of saying, we're so powerful, we can make people do anything, even build us a gigantic tomb that will stand the test of time. It's funny to think about how obsessed the pharaohs were with their legacies. They wanted to be remembered forever, and they went to ridiculous lengths to ensure that people would know their names. But in doing so, They often ended up creating monuments that, while impressive, have little practical value for anyone except archaeologists and historians centuries later. The more you look at it, the more it seems like the pharaohs were trapped in their own quest for immortality. At least, that's how we see it from the comfort of our modern-day living rooms. Imagine living in a society where your primary goal is to outdo everyone else in terms of grandeur, but no one really stops to think about whether it's worth it. Maybe, just maybe, the most enduring legacy of ancient Egypt isn't the pyramids or the golden masks, but the fact that the pharaohs were willing to make their lives and their decisions look completely absurd just to keep up appearances. The absurd lengths the pharaohs went to in order to secure their legacies didn't just stop with the construction of massive pyramids. No, these guys were really committed to making sure people would remember their names, and more often than not, they went a bit overboard in the process. One of the more ridiculous traditions that came with this was the idea of self-deification. In other words, the pharaohs didn't just want to be remembered as great rulers, they wanted to be worshipped as gods. And who wouldn't want to be a god, right? But this wasn't as simple as just saying, "I'm a god now." They had to go all out. So they built temples to themselves, not just as reminders of their reigns, but to ensure that there would be actual religious rituals dedicated to their divine selves. The idea was that after their deaths, the people would still keep worshiping them as though they were living gods. Take Pharaoh Ramses II, for example. This guy didn't just commission statues of himself, he wanted every single temple to have one, and not just a little statue here and there either. We're talking massive stone portraits of him, sitting or standing like he was some sort of divine monarch. And to make sure no one could ever forget who he was, Ramses ensured that his name was carved into literally everything. If a stone slab was going to be used for any purpose, he made sure his name was etched in there somewhere, even if it didn't really fit the context. It wasn't enough to build temples and statues, no. He needed people to know exactly who was in charge and who would be remembered forever. And guess what? The result of all this? Well, after his reign, it wasn't the impressive political stability or advancements in knowledge that were remembered. It was the ridiculous lengths he went to in carving his face into every rock in sight. The amount of stone used just to immortalize him seems borderline comical. Ramses II was so obsessed with his own image that historians sometimes refer to him as Ramses the Great, to match his own overblown self-esteem. Sure, it might have been flattering at the time, but now, when we look back, it just seems like a bit of an overzealous flex. Then there's the absurdity of royal marriages. If you think modern-day celebrity weddings are over the top, just wait until you hear about the pharaohs. They didn't just marry for love, or at least that doesn't seem to have been the priority. No, their marriages were more about political alliances, preserving power, and, you guessed it, perpetuating their godlike image. The idea was to keep the bloodline pure, as though marrying someone from another family would somehow dilute their divine essence. But here's the thing, it didn't always work out quite as planned. Pharaohs frequently married their own sisters or other close relatives, which, on paper, might sound like it could preserve the royal bloodline. But when you consider the fact that inbreeding was a real problem and that some of these marriages led to physical and mental disabilities in their offspring, the whole thing gets a bit awkward, and still, These marriages were touted as divinely ordained. No one questioned it. They just went along with it because, well, it was the pharaoh's decision. But imagine living in a world where marriage wasn't about love or compatibility, but rather about securing your place in the celestial hierarchy. That's the kind of decision-making we're talking about. And, of course, there were the absurd customs and rituals associated with death. Pharaohs were so obsessed with immortality that they had entire legions of people dedicated to ensuring their journey to the afterlife was as smooth as possible. But it wasn't just about the grand tombs. No. The process of preparing for the afterlife was borderline comical. When you really think about it, take the mummification process, for example. Sure, mummies are iconic and all, but the process itself was rather ridiculous. After death, the body had to be embalmed and preserved for the afterlife, which involved removing internal organs, drying out the body, and then wrapping it up in linen bandages. Sounds pretty standard for a mummy, right? Well, here's the part that gets weird. The pharaohs didn't just want their bodies preserved for practical reasons. They wanted to make sure that they would look just as pristine and perfect in the afterlife as they did in life. So, in some cases, the embalmers would add false eyes to the mummies or sculpt faces to make them appear lifelike. But it wasn't just the face that needed attention. Some mummies were given false hands, legs, or even extra appendages, basically anything that might help the deceased ruler appear as close to a living god as possible. Imagine that for a second, a perfectly preserved king or queen, but with extra hands glued on just in case they needed them in the afterlife. It sounds like a bad horror movie, but this was considered completely normal at the time. As if that wasn't enough, after their mummification, the pharaohs would be buried with hundreds of items. And we're not talking about simple objects either. They were buried with treasures, furniture, servants. Yes, the idea was that they would need servants in the afterlife, and even whole boats. Yes, boats. Pharaohs were so committed to the idea of a smooth ride into the afterlife that they had entire ships placed in their tombs, some even large enough to transport them across the afterlife. Imagine being tasked with building a boat not for sea travel, but so that your pharaoh could have the best possible journey into the next world. In a way, it's a bizarrely comforting thought. The idea that the ancient Egyptians were trying so hard to make sure their rulers had everything they could ever need, including a luxurious cruise into eternity. But perhaps the most absurd of all these decisions wasn't about grand monuments or even bizarre funerary practices. No, the most absurd thing was the sheer effort it took to maintain the myth of divine rule. The pharaohs didn't just want power in the moment, they wanted eternal reverence, and to do that, they had to make their lives seem impossibly grand. So, there were always the feasts, the rituals, the grandiose displays of wealth and power. It wasn't just enough to rule. They had to perform as gods. There were massive celebrations like the Festival of Opet, where the pharaoh would parade through the streets in a golden boat. It was a spectacle that required the entire population to stop what they were doing and praise the pharaoh. Imagine the level of self-esteem it would take to orchestrate such a lavish public display just to prove how divine you were. It was less about governing and more about constantly reminding everyone how important you were in the most over-the-top way possible. And let's not forget the everyday rituals that the pharaohs were expected to maintain in order to ensure their continued success. They didn't just get to sit around and drink wine all day. Well, okay, they probably did that too. But they also had to spend hours each day performing sacred rituals, making sure their kingdom stayed in balance with the gods. This meant waking up at the crack of dawn, performing offerings to the gods, and then overseeing any number of administrative tasks that ranged from organizing military campaigns to deciding what kind of bread to give the common people. It's not all glamorous, despite the golden thrones and the grandiose monuments. For all their wealth and power, being a pharaoh didn't mean getting a day off. Every decision, no matter how trivial, was seen as part of their divine duty. In the end, the pharaohs were trapped in a cycle of ridiculous decisions and absurd customs, all because they believed their immortality depended on maintaining their image as living gods. They built pyramids, wore outrageous amounts of gold, and were worshipped by millions, all so that a few generations down the line people might remember their names. It's almost tragic, really. These powerful figures, in their quest for eternal fame, ended up making decisions that seem absurd from our perspective. But then again, who's to say we wouldn't do the same thing if we had that kind of power? Maybe it's just human nature to go to ridiculous lengths to be remembered, even if, in the end, all we have to show for it is a pile of stones and a mummy with extra hands. And as we reflect on the bizarre customs of ancient Egypt, it's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful decisions are the ones that seem the most absurd in hindsight. The pharaohs were obsessed with their legacies, and in doing so, they created one of the most fascinating and bizarre chapters in history. Their legacy, though, wasn't just about their grand monuments or their divine rule. It was about how their absurd customs and decisions still make us laugh, think, and sometimes even cringe thousands of years later. Maybe that's the ultimate immortality after all. So, as we dive deeper into this bizarre world of ancient Egyptian rulers and their outlandish customs, let's pause for a moment and consider just how strange it all really was. You know, it's not just the oddities of their tombs or the excessive pyramids that are the real highlights of their reign. It's the day-to-day absurdities that fill in the spaces between. The stuff that didn't make the headlines, but was probably a regular part of life for those who lived under the shadow of the pharaohs. Like the way they decided to handle their royal family drama, or how they spent their downtime when they weren't busy making monuments to themselves. Let's start with the daily routines of the royal family, which weren't so different from any other family, except for the fact that they were probably a lot more ridiculous. For one, there was the whole issue of marriage, but not in the way we think about it today. Pharaohs didn't just marry for love or alliance like we do now. No, they often married within their own family to keep the royal bloodline pure. Imagine being a pharaoh and thinking, you know what? I've got to find someone who's just like me, literally. So they'd marry their sisters or sometimes even their daughters. I mean, it's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if their royal bloodline was really as divine as they claimed. One famous example is Pharaoh Akhenaten, who not only married his sister Nefertiti, but also took a bit of a left turn in religious policy by deciding that the god Aten should be the one and only deity. It's like he woke up one day and thought, I'm going to revolutionize Egypt's religion, and while I'm at it, why not marry my sister? Seems like a good day to make both changes. But it wasn't just Akhenaten. There were other pharaohs who followed suit, each with their own strange spin on things. It's almost as if the concept of family relationships was just an afterthought when compared to the massive, world-changing decisions they were making about how to rule. It's easy to imagine the awkward family dinners around the royal palace. Picture the scene. Pharaoh sitting at the head of the table with his sister wife at his side, children running around, and various court members nervously glancing at one another, wondering if they're next in line for some bizarre decree. You might expect there to be an air of grandeur in these moments, but instead, you can almost hear the silence in between the awkward small talk, with no one quite sure what to say, when the pharaoh just casually mentions that his next act will be to wipe out thousands of years of tradition and replace the gods with his personal favorite. But the bizarre royal customs weren't limited to their marriages. The idea of power in ancient Egypt wasn't just about ruling, it was about creating a legacy. And creating a legacy often meant doing things that defy logic in the modern world. Take the tradition of building massive tombs, for example. Now, don't get me wrong, the pyramids are amazing feats of engineering. But the lengths they went to ensure their bodies were preserved for eternity? That's where things get strange. Pharaohs didn't just want to be remembered, they wanted to be gods in the afterlife. And to achieve this, they needed to ensure they could live forever, or at least look like they were going to. This led to some of the most absurd burial practices you can imagine. The embalming process itself was an art form, with every little detail of the body being preserved. The pharaohs went so far as to have their organs removed, preserved in separate containers, and placed with their mummified bodies. That's not just dedication to the afterlife. That's commitment to being remembered for all eternity. It's hard to even comprehend how someone could take their desire for immortality this seriously, but I suppose when you're the most powerful person in the world, why not go all out? They didn't just stop at preserving the body either. The tombs were filled with treasure, servants, real or figurative, and everything the pharaoh might need in the afterlife. Imagine being buried with all this stuff, expecting that you'll just wake up one day and use it in the afterlife. That's next-level wishful thinking. The burial rituals also tell us a lot about how the pharaohs viewed themselves. They weren't just rulers of Egypt, they were gods. And gods needed to be treated with a level of respect and adoration that went far beyond any mortal understanding. Some pharaohs took this to the extreme by ordering the execution of people who were considered lesser and expected them to serve them in the afterlife. They wanted everything in place for their eternal reign. In a sense, they were throwing the biggest, most exclusive party, and the guest list was carefully curated. Only the best people, and by best I mean those who were highly expendable, could attend. But the absurdity didn't stop at burial. The royal family's behavior toward those outside their circle was often a mix of eccentricity and cruelty. Take, for instance, the role of the royal viziers, the advisors to the pharaoh. Now, these were the folks who were supposed to run the day-to-day operations of the kingdom. You might think they were given some serious power, and you'd be right. But there's a catch. These powerful officials could be executed for the smallest offenses. They didn't even need to commit a major crime. Just looking at the pharaoh the wrong way could be enough to have them removed from the scene. It was an exhausting position, and you could almost hear the collective sighs of the viziers as they nervously waited for the pharaoh to decide which one of them would be the next to go. And then there were the bizarre traditions that surrounded the pharaoh's public appearances. The royal family didn't just make public appearances. They orchestrated them like grand theater productions. Pharaohs were gods, after all, and gods needed to be seen in all their glory. So they would often perform strange rituals in public just to remind the people that they were divine. One of the most famous public spectacles involved the royal boat that would carry the pharaoh through the streets of Thebes. But this wasn't any ordinary boat. It was a floating palace that would travel through the streets as if it were a divine procession. Imagine standing on the sidelines as this boat glided by, filled with royal figures who were clearly gods in the eyes of the masses. It was almost as if they were saying, "Look, we're not just your rulers. We're better than you. We're above you. We're gods." This absurdity of power wasn't just limited to the pharaohs. It stretched to their courtiers and the ruling class, who would often indulge in lavish lifestyles that bordered on the ridiculous. Imagine attending one of these feasts, where the finest meats and wines were served, and the guests were lavished with so much attention that it seemed like a never-ending parade of indulgence. You could almost feel the weight of every decision made at those banquets. Decisions about who could speak, who could sit where, and who would be the lucky few invited into the pharaoh's inner circle. It's easy to imagine that some of these courtiers spent their days obsessing over things like which direction the sun was coming from, or how the pharaoh's royal sandals were polished, while the rest of Egypt carried on with their daily lives, hoping to get enough food and water to survive another day. And speaking of food, let's not forget how bizarre the daily comforts were in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs didn't just have fine food, they had food that was almost absurd in its luxury. Imagine a banquet that had so many courses that by the end of it, you couldn't even remember what the first course had been. The royal chefs were the true magicians of their time, creating dishes that were as much about spectacle as they were about taste. Dishes were often shaped into bizarre, intricate designs, sometimes to the point where it wasn't even clear what you were eating anymore. It was all about presentation, and let's be honest, how many of us have had a meal where the presentation was more important than the actual food? The pharaohs didn't just eat for sustenance, they ate to display their grandeur. This was their way of reminding everyone that they were indeed different. But even in their royal banquets, there were strange customs. For example, when a new pharaoh was crowned, there were elaborate feasts that included everything from animal sacrifices to the presence of exotic dancers. But even more bizarre were the meals that were specifically prepared for the gods. Food was often presented as an offering, and you could bet that the royal family took great care in making sure it was the finest food imaginable. But here's the kicker. The gods, being gods, were often thought to not actually consume the food. It was just a ritual. Can you imagine making an elaborate meal only for it to go completely untouched? It's like hosting a dinner party for people who never show up. But the strangest thing about these rituals and customs is that, despite how ridiculous they seem to us now, they were considered completely normal at the time. They were part of the fabric of daily life, and the people of ancient Egypt didn't bat an eye at what might seem absurd today. After all, when you're living in a world where gods walk among you, or at least they're supposed to, it's easy to get caught up in the belief that everything you do is part of some divine plan. And as we move through this world of absurd decisions and bizarre customs, it becomes clear that the pharaohs were far more than just rulers. They were creators of a legacy that continues to fascinate us. The oddities, the eccentricities, and the downright ridiculousness of their reigns have left an indelible mark on history, one that we can't help but laugh at, even as we marvel at their grandeur, because, in the end, no matter how strange their customs were, they knew how to make an impression. And isn't that what it's all about? So, as we continue to explore the daily lives of those living under the shadow of the pharaohs, let's remember that sometimes the most fascinating parts of history are the ones that aren't necessarily the grand dramatic events, but the small, absurd details that tell us more about human nature than we might care to admit. The Egyptians were obsessed with immortality, sure, but they also knew that in order to be immortal, you had to make sure you did something so absurd that people would still be talking about it thousands of years later. And frankly, they succeeded. But here's the thing. Despite all the drama of pharaohs and pyramids, Egypt wasn't just a kingdom of monumental structures and glorious rulers. No, it was also a kingdom where absurd decisions were made every day, and bizarre traditions were enacted like they were the most normal thing in the world. It's almost as if the more powerful you were, the more likely you were to make decisions that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching from the outside. Which, honestly, is kind of comforting, right? Like, if the Egyptians could get away with this level of nonsense, maybe we can stop sweating the small stuff. Take, for instance, the way Egyptian kings would sometimes make decisions that were purely about proving a point, even when those points seemed to come from a place of absurdity. There was this one king, Pharaoh Pepi II, who ruled for an insanely long time, over 90 years actually, which might sound impressive at first, but then you start thinking about it and realize that he had to make some questionable choices just to keep himself entertained, and maybe, just maybe, to maintain some semblance of authority over his people. One story goes that he decided that his courtiers weren't doing enough to keep his court clean. Seems fair, right? The ruler's space should be spotless. But instead of, say, hiring a few more servants, or, here's an idea, setting up some basic hygiene practices that everyone could follow, he went full-on absurd. He reportedly ordered his servants to cover themselves in honey to protect themselves from flies. So now, not only do you have to clean the pharaoh's palace, but you're also stuck in a sticky, fly-infested nightmare where even the people doing the cleaning are covered in honey. It's almost like a cruel joke where no one really wins, and the flies are the only ones living their best lives. And it didn't stop there. The eccentricities of the pharaohs weren't limited to hygiene. Oh no, they also had a thing for public displays of everything, especially wealth. Take the practice of royal favors. No, not the kind where the pharaoh gives a nice gift or a favor to a loyal subject. No, this was about the pharaoh demanding to be constantly surrounded by objects of absolute ridiculousness. Pharaohs like Ramses II took this to a whole new level, ordering absurd amounts of gold and jewels just for the sake of showing off. Think about it. This guy probably had so much gold that it would have been impractical for anyone else to even know what to do with it. And speaking of impracticalities, there was the whole obsession with the afterlife. Now, immortality might sound like a nice thing to strive for, but when you get right down to it, the Egyptians really took this to a whole new level. They didn't just want to live forever. They wanted to live forever in style. So they started building elaborate tombs that were, well, completely out of proportion with their actual needs. The pharaohs weren't just buried with a few trinkets. They were entombed with entire armies of statues, vast quantities of food and drink, for the afterlife, of course, and sometimes even their pets. Yes, there are tombs where we find not only the pharaoh's favorite servants, but also their favorite dogs sitting next to them, as if they were all supposed to enjoy the afterlife together. Can you imagine being that dog? Thinking, well, at least I don't have to go through another round of royal favoritism. But the real absurdity kicks in when you consider how some of these decisions were purely ceremonial. Take the practice of building colossal statues. The pharaohs would erect these massive statues of themselves to remind everyone just how important they were. Sure, you might think a few statues here and there would do the trick, but the Egyptians weren't satisfied with that. No, they had to go big. We're talking statues so large they could have been the centerpiece of a theme park, and they'd have a line of worshipers waiting just to get a glimpse. These weren't just monuments, they were power moves, pure and simple. It was as if every pharaoh was competing in an unspoken contest of who could get their own giant likeness made first. Of course, those giant statues didn't just serve as an ego boost. They had practical applications too, like scaring off enemies or impressing visitors. So, you're a foreign king coming to Egypt, and you're confronted with a giant statue of the ruler who's just welcomed you to their land. What do? Well, you're probably so in awe of the scale and grandeur that you forget to be concerned about the fact that this guy probably had 100 more statues just like it spread across the kingdom. Imagine the poor workers who had to carve out these giant pieces of stone. How do you even approach such a task? It's not like you can just roll up and use a little chisel. Oh, no. You're basically building something that could be seen from space. But there's more. There's always more with the pharaohs. Let's talk about the truly bizarre traditions that they embraced, because Egypt wasn't just about giant statues and golden thrones. There were also rituals. And I'm not talking about your typical run-of-the-mill ceremonial things like wearing special robes or offering incense to the gods. No. Egypt's pharaohs had a whole other level of weirdness when it came to their rituals. Take the practice of royal hearing voices. If you've ever wondered how to take yourself seriously as a ruler, here's a trick. Convince your people that you can communicate with gods and spirits at will. That's exactly what some of the pharaohs did. They wouldn't just say they were the chosen ones, they'd claim that the gods themselves were whispering in their ears, directing their every move. And if that wasn't bizarre enough, let's talk about the pharaoh's role in the rituals surrounding their coronation. Imagine, if you will, a massive crowd gathered to see the pharaoh crowned, only to find out that the official ceremony involved the ruler stepping into a pool of sacred water, fully clothed. Now, I know what you're thinking. What's the point of that? Well, it turns out that this was more than just a tradition. It was meant to symbolize the pharaoh's purification. Even though he was about to stand in front of thousands of people and receive lavish gifts, many of which were absurdly impractical. But hey, what's a little wetness in a lavish ceremony, right? All of this, of course, was meant to reinforce the idea that the pharaoh was a god on earth. They weren't just royalty, they were divine. And sure, that sounds kind of impressive in theory, but when you break it down, it's all incredibly theatrical and just kind of weird. The fact that this sort of behavior was treated as normal says something about the way these kings wanted to be perceived as larger-than-life figures who were constantly pushing the boundaries of reason. But it wasn't just the kings. The people who worked for them were often just as caught up in the absurdity. Take the famous great royal butler position, for example. This wasn't your typical servant job. Oh, no. The great royal butler was responsible for the pharaoh's food and drink, making sure everything was prepared to perfection. But the kicker, if anything went wrong, if, for example, the pharaoh didn't like his food or something was slightly overcooked, the great royal butler would be blamed, and it was considered a huge offense. In fact, sometimes the consequences were so dire that the butler could be punished with death. Yeah, that's right. Messing up the pharaoh's meal could actually cost you your life. Not exactly the kind of pressure you'd want when you're just trying to serve up a decent meal. It's also worth noting that the pharaohs didn't only make their absurd demands on the people around them, they also expected to be entertained, constantly. Whether it was lavish feasts or elaborate performances, there was always something happening to showcase the power and wealth of the pharaoh. Imagine attending a party thrown by a pharaoh and watching a full-on theatrical performance where the actors are dressed as gods and demons, all for the entertainment of one person. It's almost like a weird mix of reality TV and historical reenactment, only without the cameras and with a lot more gold. The more you think about it, the more you realize that Egypt's rulers really didn't hold back when it came to making their lives look grand. Their reigns weren't just about building monuments or waging wars. They were about creating a spectacle so grand that it couldn't possibly be ignored, one where even the smallest detail, the food, the clothing, the statues, had to be bigger, bolder, and just a little more ridiculous than what came before. It's a bit like looking back at modern-day celebrities who go to extreme lengths to get attention. The Egyptians didn't have Twitter, but they sure knew how to create a scene that would go down in history. And in the end, their obsession with leaving behind something truly memorable worked. Sure, they might have done it in some of the most absurd ways possible, but it's those bizarre and over-the-top decisions that still make people like us talk about them today. And as we go on, we'll see that while the pharaoh's reigns may have been full of eccentricities, those eccentricities were also what made them who they were, which, when you really stop and think about it, is kind of comforting. Because maybe, just maybe, in a world that feels increasingly normal, we could all use a little more absurdity in our lives. So, let's dive even deeper into how some of these pharaohs lived in their own bizarre little bubbles, locked away in their palaces, surrounded by people who were either too afraid or too dazzled by their power to point out how ridiculous things were getting. Take, for example, the fact that some rulers of ancient Egypt, particularly during the New Kingdom, took the whole concept of royalty to such absurd extremes that it bordered on self-parody. One of the most fascinating aspects of these kings and queens was their bizarre obsession with immortality. They didn't just want to live forever in the afterlife. No, they wanted to make absolutely sure that they were seen as eternal long before they even died. Pharaohs would go to insane lengths, commissioning massive monuments, building extravagant tombs, and even turning their burial sites into works of art that screamed, "Look at me, I was important." A perfect example is the tomb of Tutankhamun, which, despite being rather modest in size compared to some of the bigger pyramids, became a symbol of Egypt's obsessive need to immortalize even the most minor of rulers. There's something almost comically tragic about it. The boy king, who reigned for barely 10 years and didn't accomplish much of note, still felt the need to have a tomb filled with gold and treasures that, ironically, would only be appreciated thousands of years later, when archaeologists discovered his tomb. It's like if an ancient ruler took out an ad in the local paper saying, "Make sure I never fade from memory." Sure, it worked, but not in the way he probably imagined. And then there's the decision of some pharaohs to associate themselves with gods to such an extreme degree that it seems almost like a parody of divine right. Take Akhenaten, for example. This guy, for reasons that are still debated, decided to upend centuries of established religious practices by instituting a monotheistic worship of the sun disk Aten. Imagine walking into a meeting and declaring that from now on, everyone would worship your personal favorite god. And not only that, but you'd want all of Egypt to toss aside their beloved gods. They weren't even allowed to have a backup god. Nope, just Aten, no more room for anyone else, he might have said with a straight face. Akhenaten's obsession with Aten wasn't just religious, it was aesthetic too. His portrayal of himself and his family was so bizarrely unique that it's honestly hard to look at without laughing. Akhenaten's sculptures show him with a long, awkward neck, drooping belly, and an oddly feminine face. It's hard to decide whether he looked like an abstract piece of modern art or if he was just too determined to be remembered as a god to realize how strange he appeared. It was as if the pharaoh thought, "If I look this weird, people will talk about me forever." Well, mission accomplished. He's still one of the most bizarrely memorable rulers of Egypt, but not exactly in the way he may have hoped. Now, let's talk about Cleopatra. Ah, yes, Cleopatra. Her reign is often romanticized, at least in Western culture, thanks to her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But when you strip away the glitter and glamour of the Roman love affairs, you realize Cleopatra's approach to power was also full of strange, almost laughable decisions. You see, Cleopatra didn't just rely on her intellect or political savvy, though she certainly had those in spades. She leaned heavily on presenting herself as a goddess, which, when you think about it, was basically ancient Egypt's version of running for office. Except in this case, the office was goddess, and the political stage was the very fabric of society itself. Cleopatra took it a step further by even going so far as to have coins minted with her face and a crown of divine symbolism on them. It's like a celebrity endorsing their own product, but on an entire currency. No big deal. Imagine someone today plastering their face on every bill, convincing the whole nation that they were actually a god in human form. How absurd would that be? Yet here, in ancient Egypt, Cleopatra's propaganda was so effective that her face became synonymous with divine rule. A bizarre form of self-promotion, sure, but it worked. People still talk about her after all. As ridiculous as all these rulers were, it's also important to note that their absurdities weren't just personal quirks. They were part of the very fabric of their rule. Pharaohs didn't just rule with absolute power. They created a culture that celebrated their weirdness and indulged their whims. The idea that they could control even the smallest details of life, how people dressed, what they ate, even the animals they could own, was nothing short of insane, yet entirely effective in maintaining their control. It was a system that allowed them to manipulate everything from the people's daily routines to their spiritual lives, all under the guise of divine will. Take the tradition of the royal harem, for instance. The power of a pharaoh's harem wasn't just about sex. It was about control. A king's ability to maintain a group of wives, concubines, and children was a direct reflection of his strength and virility. And it wasn't just any kind of love story. These relationships were often governed by intricate politics and bizarre customs. Sometimes the number of wives and children was seen as a sign of the pharaoh's success, with each new royal birth bringing further prestige. It's as if the more people you could say were yours, the more of a god you appeared to be. In fact, the sheer absurdity of royal marriages is a fascinating topic. Take, for example, the tradition of sibling marriage among the Egyptian royalty. It was considered completely normal for pharaohs to marry their own sisters or brothers in order to keep the bloodline as pure as possible. But let's be real. If you were a fly on the wall of the royal palace, you'd probably be wondering, is this really necessary? The Egyptians weren't the only ancient culture to practice sibling marriage, but it's particularly odd considering the lengths they went to keep everything in the family, even at the expense of genetic diversity. There was also the deeply ingrained belief that the pharaoh was the physical embodiment of Horus, the sky god, and that marrying within the family kept this divine bloodline intact. Sure, it sounds totally normal when you're explaining it as a historical fact, but if you tried to pull this off in the modern world, you'd probably find yourself on the receiving end of some very strange looks. Now, let's not forget the pharaoh's obsession with burial rituals. Sure, modern-day funeral arrangements are already expensive, but nothing quite compares to the elaborate, over-the-top funeral rites of ancient Egypt. Their elaborate mummification processes, complete with golden death masks and tombs filled with treasures, were all part of an obsessive ritual designed to ensure the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife would be as grand as their life on earth. And just in case they had any doubts about their place in the world of the dead, pharaohs often took care to build tombs that would rival the size of entire cities. Sure, we might find it excessive now, but it was a way for these rulers to stake their claim as eternal, godlike figures. They wanted to make sure no one would forget them, not even in death. But of course, there's always the possibility that some of these over-the-top rituals were simply a reflection of the ruler's insecurities. After all, what does it say about someone when they feel the need to go to such ridiculous lengths just to ensure they are remembered? Maybe it was an unconscious recognition that their reign wasn't as solid as they pretended it was, or that they simply didn't want to face the terrifying prospect of being forgotten. Whatever the reason, these rulers didn't just want to live forever in the afterlife. They wanted to leave behind a legacy that was just as monumental, just as absurd as their reigns. And, in a way, it worked. The ancient Egyptians had a gift for turning every detail of their lives into something grandiose, something that demanded attention. They weren't content with simply being rulers. They had to be immortalized, bigger than life, in ways that would astonish future generations. And while we may laugh at how absurd some of their decisions were, the truth is that these decisions were the very things that shaped Egypt into the empire we still think about today. So, as we look back on these figures, these pharaohs who ruled with eccentricity, who made decisions that seem more fitting for a parody than history, it's worth remembering that maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different from us after all. In a world that often feels predictable, a little bit of absurdity might be just the thing we need to make our own mark. So, let's dive a little deeper into the world of those eccentric, often absurd decisions that the ancient Egyptian rulers made. Decisions so wild they might as well have been written into some ancient version of a sitcom script. These decisions weren't just eccentric, they were incredibly bizarre, and sometimes just plain ridiculous. Take, for example, the reign of Pharaoh Pepi II. Now, Pepi II wasn't exactly the picture of sound judgment, and his rule was full of strange, laughable incidents that somehow didn't seem out of place in ancient Egypt. To begin with, Pepi II took the whole concept of ruling to an entirely new level of absurdity. One of the most famous stories about him involves his personal attendants. This guy had a special fondness for using honey and sweet oils as, shall we say, personal care products. It's not the honey that's strange here, but the sheer lengths to which his courtiers had to go to accommodate his unique preferences. You see, Pepi II was quite old when he ruled, and like many aging monarchs, he wasn't quite as mobile as he used to be. So, in an attempt to keep him from being bored, or dare I say, getting a little grumpy during the long hours of his reign, his attendants would smear honey all over his body to keep flies away. I mean, who wouldn't want to be covered in sticky, sweet goo to fend off annoying insects, right? Sounds like a dream job, doesn't it? Standing around, slathering the pharaoh with honey, and waiting for flies to buzz around while you try not to gag. The things people did to keep their jobs back then, but of course it didn't end there. Pepi II's obsession with the sweet stuff extended beyond just honey and oils. He reportedly kept a small army of workers who would go to great lengths to gather up rare plants, herbs, and oils that could be used in his personal routines. The sheer amount of labor involved in just keeping a pharaoh entertained or comfortable, well, it's mind-boggling. And this is just one example of the bizarre decisions made by rulers during this time. Now, let's talk about some truly absurd traditions and customs that somehow became staples of Egyptian life. Traditions that seem straight out of a satirical history book. Take, for instance, the incredible idea that the gods were not just sacred, but they were also a handy excuse to get away with pretty much anything. Pharaohs were often treated as living gods, which sounds nice, right? But here's the catch. Being treated as a god also meant you could indulge in some really outrageous behavior. And the best part? Everyone had to go along with it. Imagine, if you will, the sheer absurdity of someone telling you, well, I'm a god, so I can do whatever I want. Not the best company to keep. For instance, let's discuss the divine right of pharaohs, to have the most extravagant funerals imaginable. These funerals weren't just about burying the dead, they were about proving just how divine one's reign had been. And in a culture where immortality was the ultimate goal, a king's tomb had to outshine the sun itself. Pharaohs ordered the construction of the most elaborate tombs, complete with intricate murals, sacred texts, and countless treasures to accompany them into the afterlife. But the real absurdity came when you realized that the tombs weren't always about the deceased's journey into eternity. They were also about the sheer amount of resources that went into building them. Imagine the labor, the materials, and the time spent just to create the most absurdly extravagant display of opulence. all in the name of, well, being remembered for all time. And then, of course, there's the bizarre obsession with pyramid building. I mean, can you imagine being the poor worker tasked with hauling giant stones all day, only to learn that your life's work might be turned into nothing more than a glorified pile of rubble centuries down the road? The pyramids themselves were impressive, sure, but the sheer number of people involved in their construction is what makes it all so tragically absurd. Entire villages of workers were mobilized to build these massive structures, and many of them likely never even saw a day off. They worked from sunrise to sunset under grueling conditions, all so that future generations could marvel at the sheer absurdity of what these kings left behind. And let's be honest, how many of them probably thought, "This is it. This is what I'm going to be remembered for, shoveling sand for a guy who thought he was a god?" But hey, that's what happened. And the pharaohs didn't stop there. Many of them had their own personal hobbies, some of which could only be described as bizarre. For instance, the pharaohs were known to indulge in extravagant feasts where they would invite hundreds of guests, fill their palaces with exotic foods, and then, when the dinner was over, just throw the leftovers away. And we're not talking about tossing out a few bits of uneaten bread and some cold soup. Oh no, we're talking about entire platters of delicacies, fish, meats, fruits, thrown away because they could afford to. Imagine a banquet so extravagant that by the end of the night, it was more about the spectacle than the food. And then there's the issue of the bizarre royal relationships. Egyptian rulers were known to marry not for love, but for political gain, and sometimes even for the sheer absurdity of it. Take, for example, the numerous instances of royal siblings marrying each other, because, of course, keeping the bloodline pure was a must. In fact, many pharaohs took it a step further by marrying their own daughters, or in some cases, multiple women at once, to ensure the power remained tightly within the family. Talk about family reunions gone wrong. When you look at the sheer amount of drama that the Egyptian elite indulged in, it makes the Kardashians look like a quiet book club. From bizarre religious rituals to extravagant, almost absurd displays of wealth, these rulers weren't just aiming for a little bit of attention, they were working tirelessly to create an eternal impression. And yet, for all their godlike status and over-the-top customs, the rulers of Egypt were still human, weren't they? Their decisions might seem ridiculous to us now, but in their time, they were just trying to make a lasting mark. A mark that, ironically, would last far longer than they could ever have imagined. So the next time you think about the ancient Egyptians, remember that the pharaohs weren't just ancient monarchs. They were showmen. They were eccentric personalities. And above all, they were extraordinary in their ability to turn the everyday into the absurd. Their reigns were full of pomp, circumstance, and a whole lot of bizarre decisions that still make us chuckle today. And in the end, that's what made them immortal. Because a little bit of absurdity, as it turns out, can go a long way in shaping history.